bubbles. We should blow bubbles.
We need most bubbles right now, but that better be down there.
I know, that's a fun.
Oh.
What did you do?
Sorry, yes, I have to.
Oh, we should take off the audio then.
But wait, don't do it in there.
Please stand by, starting soon.
Oh, you got the party logo on there. exactly what's going to be after. So some of these government manufacturing
Because she doesn't. She's great. Yes. She's a great networker. She's helping her friend and a colleague on setting up Friday university program. We had a great time for the days out there. A lot of people
It's organizing
Good to see you. I know you might. Right, and then if we have another in the end, somebody's got to sit in the front row, and it's going to be this odd. None of the seats are reserved. Yes, forward approach. I just saw Laura in Ukraine. I saw her video. Laura? Yeah, and she was, I think she was yesterday. She had a Carothers stand. Last time I was really great for presidential. And now somehow people think that was a little bit more relaxed. So it's not going to be crazy. The second part of your I thought I wanted to I'm very charged. No, we never, I figured it out. Yeah, you just more the thinker and the fighter. So you have to like on the side. The missions, decisions, and the budget for their direction.
When you look back on this,
What did you just do?
He was being a gentleman.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can I first of all welcome all of you this afternoon and thank you for joining us for what we hope will be an interesting and lively discussion. I'd also like to welcome many of our friends and colleagues, not in this room, but who are following us on the live streaming. And of course, a particular welcome to our speakers this afternoon who made themselves available to be part of this discussion. My name is Ivan Doherty. I direct our political party programs here at NDI. And we've given out bios for everybody, so I'm not going to do long introductions, and I'm not certainly going to spend a long time introducing myself. But I always use the opportunity to say that as a former Secretary General of a major political party, I tend to come to this discussion of, or this work of political party assistance with a slightly different perspective than many others. And so, having spent 20 years in politics and held positions of leadership during the highs and lows of the political cycle, I have an acute understanding of the workings of political parties, warts and all, and the challenges that parties face on a daily basis. Supporting the development of political parties remains a critical component of NDI's work around the world. But given the low level of trust in political parties by citizens everywhere, this effort remains challenging. While more and more partners are working with us and supporting political party assistance, there's still a lot of hesitancy. It's challenging. There's a concern that there are pitfalls, that it's getting involved in politics. And we always make the argument that if you're working with civil society, you're working on the demand side of the political process. And if you're not political parties, then you are interfering much more than if we're working right across the board. And more over the years, I think this has become quite accepted. Despite all the weaknesses and challenges, one thing remains certain. Without political parties, democracy cannot function. Where political parties fail, democracy fails. Hugo Chavez is quoted as once saying that he's not the cause of the problem in Venezuela, he was the result of the problem. And if you think about it, that says a lot about the kind of work that we're attempting to do in the political party assistance field. Those of us engaged in this field of political party assistance recognize the need to better communicate the various challenges, as well as opportunities, and how our approaches have evolved over time. We also need to make the case for more realistic expectations about the scale and pace of reform. As I watched the midterm election results come in last Tuesday, I had to cast my mind back to similar occasions in my own political career. On some occasions, I was feeling what I presumed the Democrats were feeling on Tuesday night. And on other occasions, I was feeling the elation on display from Republicans. So too, the experiences for political parties in periods of transition will often be characterized by significant wins followed by punishing losses, by gains and by failures. The ultimate test for political parties and for consolidation of democracy is partially how parties build on that success, but it is as much about how they react and respond to failure. The legitimacy and durability of a political system requires parties that are both responsive and resilient. The recent NDI publications that Seth will talk about momentarily are yet another spoke in the wheel, if you like, another tool in the party assistance toolbox. As we strive to build on our experiences, continue to keep pace with an ever-changing environment, this event here provides us with an opportunity to explore the advances and challenges more broadly, and we look forward to hearing from you in the discussion. As I said at the outset, I'm not going to make long introductions, but I am going to call on our friend and board member, Governor Howard Dean, to make some opening remarks before we go to the panel. And I just wanted to say that the governor has been a great friend to NDI long before he joined the board. As chairman of the Democratic Party, he threw open the doors of party headquarters to party leaders of all political persuasion from around the world. Sometimes he asked, do I really need to have this meeting? But in most cases, he was always welcoming, always held his own when it came to having those political discussions. And I've always said that his 50-state strategy as head of the DNC was the closest we've ever seen to party building in the United States. He didn't get a lot of credit for it. But as we look at party systems, we look at what parties need to do in terms of building roots. That 50-state strategy was ahead of its time. As a leader, he was always and has always been innovative in his approach, and he continues to be in huge demand by our partners around the world. Governor Dean, please.
Star-studded panel, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I do want to make a couple of remarks in view of the debacle on Tuesday night, which has affected my vision significantly. We were talking earlier about political parties, and one might think that this is a particularly awful time for political parties because, among many other things, there's been so much money sloshing around that actually the political parties are not the major funders by a long shot of any of these candidates. But the truth is, and this is truly true all over the world, that the major function of political parties is not necessarily to raise money. I mean, I would prefer that Citizens United go away, and as soon as we have another 8 years of a Democratic president, we will have a Supreme Court that actually does care what the Constitution says, so that problem will be solved. But the big problem is political parties have to organize. Political parties have to do grassroots politics. I think the results of the Ukrainian elections were incredible. 32% of the parliament, I can raise my voice, I'm very good at shouting as you know. We're going to Ukraine, then we're going to Moldova. So in Ukraine, 32% of the new parliament is under 35 years old. That's terrific. I was last in Ukraine in March for the previous set of elections, the presidential elections, or just before them, I guess. And it was remarkable to meet with the young people there who were under 30 years old. It reminded me of Berkeley, which of course didn't have laptops in 1960, when they were having this coffee house scene, and they were really enthusiastic about it. And so grassroots parties are in fact being built, which is hard to do in a country with a long tradition of having all the top-down people, the oligarchs and so forth, running political parties. Well, you know, as I said when I met with her about 3 years ago, the chief of staff of President Yanukovych at the time, you shouldn't really have oligarchs running political parties. Oh, excuse me, and our Supreme Court in the United States has just legalized oligarchs running political parties. It actually, in the long run, is not what parties are about. What parties are about is motivating individuals in an organized way to change things. And in this country, the role of grassroots has actually been expanded so dramatically by Barack Obama's 2 campaigns. I have never seen campaigns of the kind that we've seen in the last 2 election cycles here. And the Republicans have actually, as good opposition figures always do, learned a lot from that, and they did some of that this time. That's one of the reasons they were very effective. The other reason they were effective is we essentially had no message whatsoever, other than, well, we don't really like Obama that much either. When you're afraid, if that's your platform, I'm a candidate who's afraid of my own party, you lose, and we did. So what I want to say here is that political parties, as Ivan said, are indeed very important. That they are important because they're the only way of, in a permanent way, organizing an institution that has a long-term vision for the country and that has the means to go out and deliver it. One could get, as if you were a Democrat, very depressed about the events of Tuesday. But the truth is, we're still a very democratic country with a small d. The Republicans are a pretty democratic party. We nominate our candidates not because a few very wealthy people sit in a room and pick somebody. We have a process we have to go through, and if you're a delegate to the Democratic or the Republican convention, you have an enormous amount of influence over who gets to be president. They're not picked in smoke-filled rooms. That stopped in 1968 after Hubert Humphrey got the nomination in a smoke-filled room, and it hasn't been true in either party ever since. And what President Obama did is elevate that game. So they knew essentially where every potential Democratic voter was in the entire country and had metrics in terms of getting them out. So I actually think that, leaving aside the disappointments for myself of Tuesday, that we're making enormous progress in this country. It's not always obvious. And the chart of progress doesn't go like this, but it does go like this. And the thrust and the direction is up. So we have a lot of explaining to do when we go to all the countries that we're in, trying to explain why political parties are important. The newspapers talk about the money and the graft and the this and the that. The fact is that even these young people who have the internet, the most powerful empowerment tool that's been invented since the printing press 500 years ago, even they need political parties. Because one of their very few weaknesses of this incredible empowerment tool is because you can be so successful with ad hoc actions that you can avoid institutions. And you have to institutionalize the kinds of changes that are being made in politics, and the way to do that is through political parties. So I'm delighted that we have this incredibly wonderful, wonderful panel who I admire very much. I'm delighted to be on the board of an organization that works so closely with political parties, particularly integrating women and young people into the political process, which needs to happen all over the world and in the United States. We've got to keep doing it. And we've got to remember that for all the flack that political parties get, in fact, they are the only way, short of violence, of reforming the system. And I think that the world is as Steven Pinker's pointed out, getting better and better. Politics is a substitute for war. We have to remember that because when you look at politics in that light, we're on the right track. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Governor Dean. We're now going to have remarks from our panelists here, and then following that, we'll open it up for discussion. And I understand the panelists have negotiated among themselves a new speaking rota, so who am I to interfere with that? I'd like to call on Tom Carothers. He needs no introduction to this audience. There is nobody who has studied, written more, or spoken more on this topic. We at NDI and I have always valued his support and his counsel in this work on political party assistance. So I hand it over to you, Tom, please.
Thank you very much, Ivan, Governor Dean, and Ken Wallach, and friends and colleagues. It's good to be here. I'm going to just say a few words about the international context for political parties, and then a little bit about the evolution of party aid in the last 10 or 15 years, and then something about the relationship between those two things. There's a great deal of attention these days to the notable phenomenon that in countries in every different part of the world, we see protest movements. It's very striking, the range of countries that are being affected by protests, from very wealthy countries to much less wealthy countries, dictatorships, democracies, countries in between. And there's a tendency when faced with this wave of protests, I think some political analysts and theorists have started developing an idea about kind of a new form of social change based on certain kinds of often what seem to be apparently leaderless civil society movements that are spontaneous, somewhat more organic in form, and seem to be presenting a new model of sort of socio-political change. It's a tempting idea, and it's one that I think does require more thought and more study, but the implication in it that this inevitably sort of signals or marks the decline of parties, I think is a mistake. We need to be careful in that analysis. In the first case, because actually when we look more closely at some of the protest situations or contexts, we see that actually parties are very important in them. In Venezuela, for example, the protests over the last year or so are actually very much about organized cleavages in the forms of parties in Venezuela and are not simply a spontaneous movement. In fact, political parties in Venezuela have a great deal to do with them. In Thailand, the protests that have been roiling the country over the last several years and then ending up in the coup were very much connected in different ways, complicated ways, to party life in Thailand. So first of all, we need to question this assumption that when we see what look like either quote spontaneous or leaderless protests, we need to look past that picture and see how parties are in fact playing a role. It's also incorrect, of course, because there's no sharp line between the phase of protest and immediately getting down to organized politics, if you will. We see in Ukraine, a very direct movement from protest to politics, and often involving the very same people. Moving from one realm to the other. And the idea that there's sort of two different realms is also a mistaken conception, even where you have what look like spontaneous protest movements. And third, it's incorrect because what we see when we compare some cases, and I'm thinking here of Egypt versus Tunisia, and we ask ourselves, as many of us are, especially after the pretty inspiring elections in Tunisia, how did these two countries start in what looked in such a similar way and end up in such a different place? Not that it's finished, the transition in either country, but for now they're in a very different place. Actually, the role of political parties is fundamental to that answer. With Tunisia having not just political parties, also labor organizations and other kinds of civic organizations. But the political process in Tunisia that has been able to negotiate a divided polity and a divided society in some ways to a consensual electoral process wouldn't have happened without relatively strong parties that emerged fairly quickly. Whereas in Egypt, without trying to summarize the many bad things that have happened in Egypt's political transition, the weakness of parties, both in the sort of non-Islamist sector, but also the weakness of the functioning of the Freedom and Justice Party that emerged in 2011 has very much to do with why Egypt has ended up where it is. So I'm trying to say that we should take seriously this wave of protest as being a very significant international phenomenon, but avoid simplistic ideas that what this means is that politics has shifted out of the party world into a different domain. They're still interconnected. To take this a step further, I think it's important to see that there are a series of factors occurring in societies around the world that have put pressure on traditional forms of party organization and the role of parties. Part of these are the decline of sort of organized ideological systems that competed in the 20th century that are no longer having much of a hold. When one looks at the competition between, Russia, China, the United States as three major powers, trying to describe that as an ideological conflict would be basically incoherent. Because it's not really a battle of three ideologies. It's a struggle between different powers who have different interests but don't really have organized ideologies that conflict with each other. But so first you have the decline of ideologies, and then second you have the heightened individualism, which comes with the growth of technology, rising economic conditions for many people, and the sort of increase in personal space that many citizens live in societies, and the feeling that parties are often outside their immediate area of concern. And with this increased personal space comes more flexible attachments to a variety of organizations. We've developed this idea of the postmodern individual or citizen as someone who, why would they just ascribe to one political party when they can belong to this network, that organization, and go to this website and be here on social media, and that parties just don't fit that world anymore, is the thinking. So between the decline of ideology and this sort of changed role of individualism, and I would call it personal space, and these two things connecting with each other, one can reach the conclusion that party or 20th century phenomenon that really can't have a place in the 21st century or won't likely have a serious place. But I think that's missing something more central, which is when you look beyond the decline of ideology and beyond the sort of technocratic individualism that we sometimes see, what does really seem to drive citizens towards action in many places, and what seems to eat at them in so many societies is actually the hunger for representation. There's a tremendous desire for citizens to feel their interests represented by people who have power in this society, and a frustration over the inability to, make the representation of interests work. And so, although it's true that politics has become more performance-oriented rather than ideologically oriented, to put it in simple terms, the fact of the performance orientation being so central doesn't mean that parties won't be part of that. What it means is that parties will be different, and that old spectrums of left-right parties around the world are largely declining. But that doesn't mean that parties therefore have no place, because if what citizens really want is the representation of their interests, they may have flexible attachments with different organizations, but they are going to find and have found in places like Tunisia that the role of parties does remain not necessarily central, but it is central to the actual functioning of the system, even if it isn't as central to the individual life. So this is a complicated way of saying what Governor Dean did and others at NDI often said, which is we don't really have a substitute here, even though we have changed kind of nature of individual life. Now, a few words about party aid. To start with, the world of party aid, it actually keeps growing. And we don't always see it because much of the growth has been outside of the Washington circle of organizations engaged. In the last 15 years, for example, we've seen creation of the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy. The Finnish government has set up a demo, an organization devoted to party assistance. The Danish Institute for Parties and Democracy has been established in the last 5 years. International IDEA has moved into the world of party assistance. The UK government, through DFID, has started supporting party work in different ways in different countries. And interestingly, the world of party aid does actually keep expanding. And it is much larger today by almost any measure than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. On the other hand, it's very noticeable to me, I've devoted some work in recent years to examining the political inclination, if you will, of the development community and tried to chart how many people in the traditional socioeconomic development community have gotten more interested in politics and are trying to think politically and work politically. That is true, and it's an important trend of the World Bank or other traditional socioeconomic aid organizations, but it has not crossed over into the party world. It is still the case that the traditional will say in sessions, of course we need to think politically and sometimes even act politically. They still see something like a Grand Canyon between them and political parties, and they remain, in most cases, not all, in most cases, not willing to try to cross that. And so the world of party aid still remains in some ways somewhat separated from this traditional world of development. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing per se. It has different kinds of implications. So it's a double message. On the one hand, party aid is growing, but it's still remaining somewhat separate from other parts of the assistance community. Now, when I wrote a book about 9 or 10 years ago about party assistance, and I tried to sort of capture the state of the field then. And when I did, there were a number of what I thought notable features. I'll just emphasize the negative ones here, because I don't have time to talk about the positive ones. The negative ones were the following: that the field was stuck in many ways. I'm talking about all party aid organizations except, of course, NDI. The field was stuck in often a sort of antiquated model, in my view, of essentially institutional transfer, trying to say we know what a good party looks like here, and we're going to go to your country and try to help you build a good party here through sort of traditional knowledge transfer. Second, it was marked by a devastating lack of analysis of context, simply a tendency of people to assume that this party sphere, and that we know what a good party system looks like, and every country needs one, whether it's Georgia or Mongolia or Bolivia, and so we kind of know what to do. And sure, of course, we need to know what the language is, and whether it's a dictatorship or not, but not a really serious focus, in some cases, on context. And I'm oversimplifying, because obviously good practitioners in the field know their context and shape their programs accordingly, but at the top, many of the impulse of some party aid organizations was insufficient attention to context. Third, there wasn't enough attention to party systems. followed from the lack of attention to context. There was too much emphasis on individual parties, the idea that the challenge here is to get several functioning parties rather than to think about the structural impediments to a party system. At the time, an uncomfortable relationship, and this is not the case with either IRI or NDI that tend to do multi-party work, there was an uncomfortable relationship to the stark fact in the world that traditional center-left, center-right divisions are in decline in most countries, and having party work based on ideological families gets harder and harder when you're working in Mongolia and Tunisia and elsewhere, rather than in Eastern Europe or Latin America. These were some of the features. Looking today, and I'll finish with this, is one sees, I think, some positive changes. And that's where the guide comes in that the NDI has produced. First, you do see some movement away from the institutional transfer model and towards much more flexible and much more, I would say, thoughtful work in trying to help organizations emerge that are adapted to local circumstances. If you look in the guide, I recommend to you the couple of the boxes, which are really interesting. Look at the box on Burkina Faso, leaving aside the terrible events in Burkina Faso. Good timing on that, the big Burkina Faso. It's a very interesting program that reflects a very sophisticated view of what is the role of certain socio-political actors in politics of the country. Or look at the box on Pakistan and really try to spend a little bit of time looking at what NDI did in Pakistan over the last 5 to 7 years. It's notable, working in very difficult conditions in a political system, swimming in problems, but to still find an entry point with certain kinds of local organizations that are trying to play a positive role politically. It's a long way down the road from here's a good party, you should be a good party. And we haven't in some ways registered that evolution, and I'm trying to do that here, and I think the guide does that. In addition, I think that's part of that context analysis. I mean, look through the sections of this guide on context analysis. I sort of think if I lifted them up, went back in time and showed them to Ken Wallach 20 years ago, he would say, this is typical USAID, telling us to do all these detailed studies. What is this? This is a very thoughtful, elaborated section on how to think about the local context. Because part of you think, well, of course I'll study the local context. Go through that section and realize the complexity of studying it. And I commend NDI for, I'm joking about the USAID relationship, but it's that NDI has approached the need to do more systematic thinking and study without getting caught in bureaucratic politics in a way that I think is commendable. I've never seen an analysis of what to do on context analysis for party work as well. I've seen very few, but this is the best elaborated I have seen. And finally, another uncomfortable condition, actually, I forgot to mention, 10 years ago was a very difficult relationship with the world of monitoring and evaluation. Party work 10 years ago largely tried to fly under the radar screen of monitoring evaluation, hoping they would be left alone by the sort of the dark system of monitoring and evaluation that existed out there, and felt that party work just didn't fit very well, which is true if you have a bad monitoring and evaluation system. And again, this guide has tried to thoughtfully say we can be part of that conversation. It is possible to evaluate our work, but we need to do so in a thoughtful way. And there's nothing wrong with indicators as long as some thought goes into what the indicators are and so forth. And so step by step, as you read this guide, what you're reading is a testament to the fact that this field is evolving. It is moving forward. And it isn't just NDI. IRI has made important advances, as have a number of the European actors as well. But this guide is one of the few formalizations of that learning in a very compact and useful way. So it leads to my conclusion, which is the hard question we have is, it remains the fact that after 20 or 30 years of party aid in many parts of the world, if you go to most countries and ask a citizen, what do you think of the political parties in the country, you tend to get a very negative answer. That's just a fact of life. And the answer is very similar in most countries. And that can make you think, what have we been doing for the last 20 or 30 years? If that's the case, why have we been doing what we do? And has it made any difference? But I think beyond the negative answer that the average citizen will give you, if you look more closely at the party scene in many places, it's the citizens are unhappy, have been, and probably will be for a long time, but actually things are improving in many places. I wrote a piece last year about the Egyptian opposition party scene, which is in pretty But the piece says that when you look more closely, stop dismissing this team. Stop just saying it's a bunch of feckless people who will never amount to anything. That's just not the case. There has been real progress in the Egyptian party scene, even despite the devastations that have come from the top of Egyptian politics, in the degree of organization in certain parties, the strategic thinking by young activists, the changing sort of structure of organizations of some parties. And that's just Egypt, which is not a very good picture for the most part. There are dozens and dozens of countries around the world where when you look more closely at the parties, there are positive things happening. But the citizens are going to remain unhappy. They're unhappy here. You know, and we have pretty good democratic politics, and citizens are really angry at the parties for good reasons. And so we shouldn't be, you know, if the evaluator in the sky comes down and says, you haven't done anything in 20 years, the citizens are unhappy as they were 20 years ago. That isn't actually the measure, even though it's important that they're unhappy. We need to take it seriously. But real progress has been made and real things are happening in this domain, and this guide is part of that.
Thank you so much, Tom. You know, we were a little worried that we were overusing the quote that you kindly gave us in the feedback, but I think we've got a few more from today's presentation, so thank you. Seth Ashgilbor, my colleague and partner on the Political Parties team, has been with NDI for almost 2 decades, and I've been fortunate that a lot of that time has been on my team. And while I often point out, as I did earlier, I'm a politician, Seth seems to take a lot of pleasure in making the point that she never was and never has been a politician. And never will be. But she may not have come from a political party or been involved in a political party, but there are very few people who know the workings of a political party inside out and party systems, and who thinks and writes so much about this over the years than Seth does. And it's a tribute to her, many of the feedback that we've been receiving to her work, and that of our colleague Nick Benson, who is standing quietly over there, who was the other principal author of the document. So Seth is now going to take a few moments to walk us through those most recent publications. Thanks, Seth.
Thanks, Ivan. Before I talk about the framework, I wanted to acknowledge the National Endowment for Democracy, which very generously provided the funding while Nick and I tried to figure out what it was we wanted to say and how we wanted to say it. I'd like to start by providing some background on why we developed this framework, although I think Tom has given some of the explanation for that. Then I will give a brief description of the framework itself, and then close with a few words on where we go from here. As assistance providers, I think one of the biggest challenges we face is providing better evidence of our ability to produce results, and also to more clearly articulate our theories of change. And I think one of the most significant wake-up calls I've had in my time at NDI was a few years ago, when we had a series of conversations with some pretty heavyweight academics and M&E experts who were involved in assessing political party programs. And over a series of conversations that lasted for many, many months, I eventually came to the realization that there was actually a lot going on in our programs that we didn't talk about for many different reasons. Around the same time, some of our own staff were expressing frustration with the slow pace of reform in their operating environments, and were facing difficult questions from donors as well in terms of theories of change and evidence of results. As Tom pointed out, over the years, NDI programs had moved beyond basic capacity building to efforts to support reforms in party practices and in political processes. In addition, we were working in a much wider range of environments than in the 1980s and 90s. And although some of our changes had evolved, there was no structured framework for communicating some of those changes. While program documents did refer to the incentives that shape prospects for party reform, these factors were not always explicitly referenced in program strategy, and this, of course, created a variety of problems. Program documents presented a rather simplistic view of what were actually quite complex programs. Key aspects of party programs were implicit rather than explicit, and often capacity building was presented as the primary driver of reform, when in fact, as we all know, factors were far more influential in shaping prospects for party change. Finally, because of all these lapses, we were missing opportunities for deeper learning about why change happens, why certain programs succeeded, and why others fell short of expectations. basically, we were doing a good job of describing how parties operated, why they needed to behave differently, but saying very little about why they behaved the way that they did and what implications that had for reform. As has been said so many times before, context matters, but we needed a framework that would help us more explicitly convey why it matters and how it matters. So we set out to map all the different factors that influence political party behavior. Based on desktop research and interviews with some of our own field staff, we came up with a long list of factors that we then categorized under 3 different headings: political will, political space, and capacity, hence the name of the framework, Will Space Capacity Framework. We used a Venn diagram to convey that these factors often overlap. I knew this was going to happen. There we go. Thanks, Nick. Okay, I'll just keep going. So we came up with a Venn diagram to convey these 3 different factors and how they overlapped and interacted with each other. The first was political will, which refers to a combination of the formal and informal institutional context. Political space refers to the environment in which political parties operate and how they interact with it. And finally, capacity, which is pretty self-explanatory, refers to the skills and resources that political parties need to compete in elections, conduct outreach, and formulate policies. These 3 drivers also loosely correspond to the different types of political party interventions that NDI and other assistance providers conduct: building capacity, expanding space for parties or for participation within parties, and helping to build political will for reform. And I have 2 very short examples to illustrate, and fortuitously, they're the same examples that you referred to, Tom. So for the first example, we head to Pakistan, where, as Tom mentioned, NDI has been supporting local efforts to secure the rights of political parties to organize in the federally administrated tribal areas. So this would be an example of programming to expand space for parties. Under a ban on political parties in the tribal areas that was a holdover from the British Empire, political parties were not able to operate in the federally administrated tribal areas until 2011. This development in 2011 was the result of efforts by a multi-partisan group to develop and prioritize recommendations for reform, present their case to the executive, and maintain pressure for change. For the second example, we head to Burkina Faso, where the decentralization process created thousands of councillor positions, significantly expanding opportunities for women to run for political office. But those opportunities would only become a reality if political parties had the will to select significant numbers of women candidates and to field them in places where they actually had a chance of winning. This began happening to some extent with the ruling party, but it was not institutionalized across the board. So in addition to providing skills training to help potential female candidates take advantage of these opportunities, NDI supported the efforts of civil society and other local groups to secure a gender quota that is now creating legal incentives for parties to field more women candidates. The Institute also helped political parties develop plans for complying with the quota and continues efforts to support work by civil society to improve enforcement of the quota. So in this case, the program combined capacity building with strategies to create incentives or political will for reform. So the main point here is that while programming can focus on one or more of these dimensions, it is really when we see 2 or all 3 of these elements aligned that we see the greatest potential for impact in terms of party reform. So in addition to the drivers, we expanded on the framework by adding a second level that outlines the attributes that we believe political parties need in order to contribute to democracy. The first component of the attributes refers to principles of accountability, participation, and inclusion. And we've interpreted this to mean not only how political parties organize themselves or treat their members internally, but the extent to which they respect the rights of others outside their own organization to participate in political processes. The second component of the attributes refers to the competencies, so more technical, that parties need to fulfill their roles: policy formulation, outreach, and the ability to organize or manage their own organizations. Finally, the third level of the framework outlines the functions through which political parties contribute to representative democracy: proposing policies, competing in elections, and contributing to governance. And here we've taken a broad definition of governance that recognizes that both ruling and opposition parties have important roles to play in democracies. So how does the framework help? We know that context matters. It is, if we implement the same activities in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Mexico, Kenya, and Uzbekistan, we are likely to see very different results. More importantly, replicating those same activities across those very different environments is unlikely to be appropriate. We also know that while capacity building is an important aspect of political party assistance, much more is required to achieve changes in how political parties conduct outreach, propose policies, and compete in elections. So our goal in developing this framework was to provide a structured approach for examining strengths and weaknesses in political parties and party systems, as well as the key factors influencing that behavior. The basic premise is that by asking different questions and by separating the what and the how political parties and party systems from the why, we can develop a better understanding of potential obstacles to and opportunities for reform, identify program strategies that better take those factors into account, determine anticipated outcomes that are more consistent with our planned interventions, and strengthen learning on what works, why, and under what conditions. A few weeks ago, we released 2 publications that provide additional information on how to use the framework. The context analysis tool, as Tom mentioned, describes the type of information we need to collect. It includes a framework of research questions and outlines different methods for collecting information. It also recognizes that assistance providers will come to this with different objectives in mind. In some cases, assessments are conducted with a relatively blank slate, and there's the opportunity to conduct a pretty comprehensive review of a country and then make recommendations for which areas should be prioritized. In other cases, a particular priority has been identified, such as women's political participation, and it is primarily a case of digging deeper on that specific issue. The programming guide provides a more detailed explanation of the framework and is loosely designed to follow the program lifecycle. As a result, we hope that users will be able to dip in and out depending on where they are in their programs, or if they have time, read it more comprehensively. It discusses the type of analysis that should take place prior to designing a program and how to apply that analysis. It also incorporates various practical instructions, worksheets, and sections on various topics like problem tree analysis, selecting which parties to work with, and choosing activities. It also includes a very loose typology of party systems and some of the common challenges in each. So where do we go from here? We hope that these publications, as I mentioned earlier, will help us better think through how issues of political will, space, and capacity impact party behavior and prospects for reform. That they will also help us adjust our strategies to better take these factors into account and develop expected outcomes that are more consistent with our planned interventions. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, ask different questions about why change is happening or why not. In addition, we hope that we plan to use the framework to structure a series of internal discussions with our own colleagues, but also to conduct some studies on common challenges, effective strategies, and lessons learned for different areas of programming. Through that process, we hope to identify new approaches to programming and develop better tools for capturing what works and under what conditions. These efforts should also help us test and refine the framework further so that we can improve it over time and develop some case studies to illustrate the core concepts. But we also hope that the framework will contribute to ongoing conversations about how we can improve the effectiveness of party assistance. Several groups are updating their frameworks, clarifying their theories of change, and working to improve monitoring and evaluation. We are very much interested in hearing about some of the differences and similarities in approaches, as well as other efforts to improve the effectiveness of party assistance. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seth. And our final speaker is Neil Levine, Director of the Center of Excellence for Democracy at USAID. He's new to the job, but certainly not new to the topic over many years. And we really appreciate that in a busy few weeks since taking over that you've been able to come here and join the discussion. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you, Ivan. First of all, I want to thank MDI, Ken, and Ivan for the invitation to be on such a distinguished panel and with honored guests. And I'll distinguish myself by being not an expert in this area. I'm just a simple bureaucrat trying to make my way in the world. I want to congratulate Ivan and Nick for the work on this toolkit. I know that these are often viewed as a labor of love, and they represent the work of many, many folks. And I really commend you for all the good work. It really, as Tom has indicated, a real advance in our thinking here. I also want to say how pleased I am to be here with Tom Carothers. As Ivan said, he's thought more and written more on these topics than just about anybody else, and that's just since breakfast. So you get a sense of his contribution. And I've always looked at Tom as really a thoughtful critic and helpful commentator for us that really raises the level of our work, and he's been doing it for some time. And he really is a strategic ally for all of us who are working in that field to goad us to just tighten our rigor and raise the level of our game. And so thank you once again, and it's a pleasure to be with you here. And the special treat of having Governor Dean here, you know, as a citizen and a voter, smart goes a long way with me in a politician, and leadership goes a long way with me for someone who is taking principled stands on questions of war and peace and progressive social policies in this country. And service goes a long way. So I thank you, Dr. Dean, for all that you've done for our country. Let me spend the time. I know that folks have a lot of questions. Did Ken Wallach take the last cookie? And other questions. I'll be brief. I want to make comments in 3 areas. First of all, I want to talk about how USAID views the work of political party assistance in the context of our new strategy. All of you who have read that strategy, I'm sure, that Ken told me that. And second, that in looking at the toolkit itself, what really jumped out at me from a donor's perspective, and what I think our field staff, what their reactions would be to this as well. And third, maybe plant a few questions that come to mind in working for further use and really capitalize on the expertise that's in the room when we get into discussion. So let me just talk briefly about the DRG strategy for those of you who have not read it yet. We released it again in 2013. As a member of the task force that worked on this strategy, what were we trying to accomplish? For those of you who read the 1996 strategy, which was the last time we looked at this, really wasn't much of a strategy, but more of an explanatory document of what we do in the field. And it really was centered around the 4 pillars of elections and political party processes, and that's where we resided, the work on political party assistance, governance, rule of law, and support for civil society. And it was really like, here's what we do. And when we got together to think about the new strategy, first of all, we wanted to honor all the work and all the learning that had happened before that, and really focus on 2 dimensions of legitimate governing institutions or accountability on the one hand, and participation on the other, as being kind of the 2 axes of our strategy. But what needed to happen now was really 2 things. One was to bring front and center the work that we were doing and have done on human rights, to make sure that we were honoring and giving a mandate to field officers to protect human rights victims, to promote institutions and deepen respect for human rights across the board. And so there was a real shout out and kind of conceptualization of a mandate for work in human rights more specifically. And then finally, and I think most importantly, was to bring DRG, or democracy, human rights, and governance approaches across all development sectors, so that the fact is, in many cases, technical development solutions were failing for lack of appreciation of the governance problems that underlie these systems. Tom has written on this extensively, as have others, but it really needed to be captured not only in our strategy, but in our business model, and we're working to do that. And that's a real tough slog in what is admittedly a new field. First strategy in 1996, so we don't have as long a history as 50 years or more in health or education in other areas. And so when it comes to looking at political party assistance in the context of this new strategy, let me make a few comments about the connections that we see. First of all, on the issue of inclusive development and inclusive democratic systems. In the function as gatekeepers, political parties are a powerful force for the inclusion of women, youth, other traditionally marginalized groups, first within their own leadership and policy development processes, and also as candidates for elective office. When parties themselves are more representatives of society, so too do governance and institutions policies reflect that. And this is affirmed in the new programmatic guide. Second, representation and participation. We have a development objective in the language of AID that talks about promoting participatory, representative, and inclusive political processes. And the word representative was placed there very deliberately, as political parties are a key institution that enable representation in a democratic political system. Talking about integration, just as we want to see integration across the development enterprise, we think that countries, political parties dealing with social issues want to see democratic practices inform their social policies. And so appreciation of how democracy and government's participation affects your economic policy, your health policy, your social policies across the board. Accountability, almost axiomatic, how political parties hold governments accountable through their oversight function, through the workings of internal democracy to make a coherent voice and message, to give citizens a choice of political preferences, and then in the manner of a loyal opposition to hold a ruling party accountable. And then finally, protection of human rights, advancement of human rights norms, both in the legislative function, in the advocacy function for those who are at risk. Let me turn now to the toolkit and make a few comments. For me, in evaluating any kind of toolkits, I have a really simple rule. Toolkits should have tools, guidance should guide. And believe me, some things that we see don't really pass that test. So I found that very helpful. I think I'm going to make 3 points about what jumped out at me in this particular toolkit. Rest easy, Seth, it passed the test at a superlative level, okay? One of the pitfalls, I think, in this critique has probably been made before is our approach seems to be, here's how an idealized party works, this is where this party is now, and what can we do to get it up to snuff? And after laboring in that with that construct, we realize that that's really problematic for any number of reasons. And a better fit or a better construct is to meet these parties where they are and understand the dynamics and what incentives are at work. And so and I think that is sort of the critique that comes from how we developed it, working within that model, those cookie cutter approaches to party assistance that we need to get away with. And I think the toolkit in the framework of will, space, and capacity gives us a framework. What I look for first in terms of the content of a toolkit is, first of all, does it give us frameworks to give us an intellectual understanding? Second of all, does it give us a vocabulary and a shared vocabulary so we can navigate kind of the conceptual terrain of the problem we're looking at? And I think this passes on both accounts. The second area would be the use of political economy analysis that is kind of both explicitly and implicitly behind the design. It seems to be in the ascendance in many of the work that we're doing in other sectors as well. It really comes down to understanding with some precision what is the underlying governance bargain at play in these societies. What are the incentives that animate that bargain, and how, as political party actors, do we influence it in one way or another? I was really heartened to see that once you understand it, that makes possible the development of an operative theory of change, as Seth emphasized. And again, a theory of change has been called different things, but it is, in essence, how do you think the world works? What, with the application of an activity, dollars, diplomacy, what is your expected outcome, and how will you know when you get there? So that incorporation of a theory of change as a best practice here in program design, I think, is a huge advance, particularly in as slippery an area as political party assistance, where there's so many factors at play. And then the final area, I would say, just the helpful guidance. I think Tom did a shout out to some of the cases, the country cases. I look to some of the, here's how to conduct an interview. Here's how to look at and define the space. Here are useful terms. And the thing that we get the greatest demand for from field officers, as you might expect, is to bring it down to, okay, that's a very nice political theory, but how do I make this program go, and where do I start? So you have really, from a very operational standpoint, something that's going to get buy-in and readership and uptake because it helps them do their job better. Finally, let me turn to 3 or 4 questions. I think one of them has already been kind of time in memoriam. How do we evaluate success or failure in this area? One other intriguing question that I know NDI, IRI, and the other folks working in this area have said, how does external assistance promote internal democracy within a political party? Are the issues and dynamics and incentives at play subject to influence by assistance? I think is another way to say it. Another interesting question is, how do we deal with parties that don't have an interest in genuine representation embedded in their DNA? Some parties are in fact fractured. They're corrupt. They're unwilling to form coalitions. They may be personalized. They may be atomized, even after years of receiving our assistance. And so what does that mean? Is there a need to acknowledge that in some cases, parties that were set up simply, purely as vehicles for the pursuit of power by a narrow elite have little chance of becoming representative, despite the best intentions of donors and practitioners? And finally, this question is really partly answered by today, which is how we can learn, continue to learn about what works and what doesn't under different circumstances, as Seth put it. How can we learn together in a truly inclusive fashion that includes donors, implementers, and I think I would add the political parties and individuals themselves. And I think when we're preparing about this, and I really want to end it with Ivan and Governor Dean as practitioners of the fine arts of political. We understand that some of the best assistance we give is on this peer-to-peer network, and the gulf and that we have to jump as a technical assistance provider to support that kind of nuanced and very human interaction is really difficult to quantify, but is very much, we know it's kind of essential in the character of the assistance we deliver. But how can we bring that experience and learn from that experience, capture what's good, and then replicate it elsewhere? I'll close there. I want to thank NDI for the gracious invitation, commend you for the particular contribution of this piece of work, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of our speakers for a great contribution to this discussion. Before I open it up, I also want to join with Seth in welcoming our friends from the National Endowment and acknowledging Barbara and colleagues, the support that we got for this project, but not just this project, a number of many other interesting projects that we do that are cross-cutting or more party sensitive and not programmatic in itself. So I just want to pay tribute and acknowledge that contribution. I'm going to open it up and we'll take maybe 2 or 3 comments or questions at a time. I would ask you to bear in mind to, when you do speak, let us know who you are and what organization you represent, but also wait until the microphone gets to you, because part of this is being streamed live and being followed in many parts of the world. So we want to make sure that they hear the questions as well as they hear the answers. So we're ready to open it up. Who's going to be first? Laura, you need to get your microphone right up to you.
Thanks for this event and thanks for the books, which look very interesting. Tom, I wanted to follow up on your comment, though I'd be happy for responses from any of you, about parties being unpopular, because we know that's true, and the measure of whether or not there should be party assistance should not be how popular or unpopular parties are. That I accept. But still, I am intrigued about why parties are so unpopular, whether there are instances when parties have been popular, and does it matter? I mean, it should matter somehow. Why are they so unpopular?
Over here. Just identify yourself.
Troy Futrell from the Department of State. I was looking at the framework with the component of will. I was wondering if the panelists would address how the incentives of party members are addressed, because people respond to incentives. And it seems that in many political structures, the overarching goal is to maintain party discipline. And if that is how a member has his or her position, how do you develop, how do you address a tension between the party discipline and the service to a constituency?
And one more.
Thierry Ouamahoro, NDI. I'd like to get your panelists' take on the idea of providing direct financial or material support to political parties in the course of implementing political party programming. We all recognize that parties are very important institutions in the democratic process, but they're some of the only institutions that in many developing countries that do not get direct financial assistance. Many governments get aid. Many of them might even collapse if they didn't get aid. Armies, national police, hospitals, they get direct assistance, but parties do not. CSOs, a lot of the time we hear civil society in X country is very vibrant, and one can assume that probably because they get a substantial amount of financial aid directly or material support directly. And to a certain extent, political parties in power, the ruling parties, due to the fungibility of aid, do benefit from aid indirectly, one can say. So the opposition sometimes are the only ones that are left without that kind of support. Can you see in any fashion, any way that one can envision in the course of implementing political party programming where they can provide direct financial material support?
Thank you very much. We'll just move over and back to the panel at this stage. Tom, if you'd like to maybe start off.
I'll address the first and third questions of it. Laura, I think the unhappiness with parties, if you listen carefully to somebody who's describing their unhappiness with the parties of their country, you could divide their unhappiness into 3 categories. The first are characteristics of the party which they find negative. For example, they feel that the party elites are corrupt, or they feel that the party elites only serve the interests of themselves and not the people, and so forth, sort of negative characteristics. Secondly, they express unhappiness with what I tend to think are, this is democratic politics, get used to it. They find that parties bicker a lot and are always fighting over little things, which is true, and it's unpleasant. There's so much wasted time and energy, and they'll describe things, but you think to yourself, you're probably just going to have to learn to live with that. That's, parties are like that, and parties fight a lot, and people in parliaments just spend a lot of time, wasted energy, but that's that. And then third, I don't like the parties because my life is not very good, and it must be their fault, and it may be that it's a a country with a lot of inequality, and they see, their neighbors with a lot more than them, and they're very unhappy about that. And in some sense, that may be some of the party's fault. It's probably the fault of a lot of different things and structures and forces. And so I usually, if I'm having an active discussion with someone, I'll say, I think it's reasonable to strive for a society where you don't feel parties are corrupt and you feel the elites do actually care about you and so forth. Probably not worth striving for a party system where every politician is admirable as a person and doesn't bicker and is not, an egomaniac with current politicians and president in the room accepted. And third, yes, parties have an obligation to better your life, but this is a very poor country and has been for a long time and probably still will be, and that doesn't necessarily mean your parties are dysfunctional. They may be contributing, maybe help. So you have to break it out. You have to try to help, sort of clarify your own thinking about that fact. With respect to money going directly to parties, there have been a couple of experiments with that. The Dutch had in the early years of operation from 2001 to 2007 or 8, they had a number of party assistance programs where they put aside a bunch of cash and then they divvied it out to the parties on the basis of applications in relationship to quotas based on their representation in Parliament. It was for project support, so that the party would apply and say, we want to do an internal training seminar and we'd like 20,000 euros to do that and so forth. I reviewed a couple of those programs. I was an evaluator of some of them in Guatemala and Mozambique and other places. And I sat with the file and looked at the project proposals and visited the parties and talked about what they did with it and so forth. And I'll come back to that in a second. And the UK has in some countries, not very many, a few African countries, I think Uganda, I can't remember, but I may be misspeaking. DFID did have, I think, some programs where they provided assistance actually directly to parties in the form of financial transfers. My general instinct is it's not a good idea. It's true that parties are struggling in competition with civil society organizations that may be getting cash from the outside and government institutions that are getting loans or grants from donors. But I think the waters are too dangerous there. I think given all of the pressure on outside assistance, if parties were getting money directly in most cases from outside actors, it would lead to too many suspicions and problems and so forth. And secondly, you could say, well, why isn't this the same with NGOs? I think in some cases, if parties are focused on how do I get a grant, that's the wrong thing for them to be focusing on. That also shouldn't be the focus of a civil society organization either. But I think for parties, it's particularly dangerous to go down the road of thinking that if only I had money, I could do a lot of things, because that's not a good way to think about party building in those cases. Of course, money is relevant, and of course, parties are asphyxiated with their lack of funding in many places. But I actually just don't think it's going to be very effective if donors decide that's going to be their approach to party building.
Seth,
Sure. I'll take the question on the balance between participation and discipline. I think that the word that I would like to emphasize there is balance, and helping party leaders and members find that balance. One of the things we've tried to emphasize in our work with political parties is that there are institutional safeguards that you can put in place in different areas, whether it's in terms of the functioning of your parliamentary group or how you select candidates, that gets everyone on the same page about the fact that we need a cohesive party in order to be strong, but we also want participation. So I think laying out different ways for parties to find that balance in a way that makes sense for them, but also recognizing that this is also something that largely depends on context. So as Neil said, meeting them where they are and trying to help them to find that balance. On material assistance, I largely agree with Tom. I think that there are situations in which I think exceptions should be considered and are probably warranted, but in a lot of cases, there are also legal issues involved, both in the recipient country and in the donor country.
Yeah, this is not an area that I know well, but so I found very helpful. The policies laid out quite clearly. At least NDI's policy on material assistance is laid out there, falling behind my co-panelists. I wanted to address the second question on political will, mostly with a negative example and not understanding the context. And I think this has largely been solved. I hope it has been, in terms of an example of when party or a program calls for strengthening a constituent office when you have a parliamentary system. No matter how well you did, no matter how well his constituent or her constituent service approved, the incentives really were on the list and the politics within that. And so we were really pushing in the wrong area. So they could be performing great, they fall off the list, their district is transferred. It really is, what was the internal party discipline that we should have been focused on? And so, again, it goes back to that the context analysis tool where, what is going to make this system behave in a certain way? And is our systems aligned in that direction? Hopefully that's now a lesson long learned, and we can sort of focus on what the chore ahead of us, which is really understanding those dynamics and how they work, which is at the heart of your question.
Thanks, Steve. We'll do one more quick round. Yes, Denise, we need a microphone. And somebody else indicate so that I know where to go afterwards, or we can have a microphone by you. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Denise Barrett, the Center for International Private Enterprise. This toolkit joins a long line of NDI wonderful toolkits. I know that we can use it at site in terms of our work with political parties. And this is kind of the basis of my question. I know you've done a previous toolkit dealing with policy change, and one of the terms that a lot of people talk about is policy space. And I was wondering if you could extend a little bit how your work with the idea of will, capacity, and political space can impact policy space, particularly because in some parliamentary systems, there are parties that are only active in electoral activities and less active in policy change. Thank you.
Yeah, Al Milliken, AM Media. I was particularly interested if any of you have experience with and any concerns or challenges with parties that would identify with Islam.
Hi, my name is Asi Bansheva. I'm with USAID. And as it was acknowledged, the field of party development has seen multiplicity of assistance providers, but at the same time, as we all know, many of the parties in the countries where we work are now able, and they do hire private consultants and private companies, many of them American private companies, and it's a multi-million-dollar business. And I was just wondering, that's a question to Ivan and to Seth, how this phenomenon influences the work that you all do.
Seth, do you want to deal with the first question? Denise is on policy.
So if I understand your question correctly, Denise, it's, what does this framework mean, or how could it be applied to issues around policy development? Is that?
In part, and also this policy space, because there's like a layer cake. Policy space, maybe political space is larger. Political will can impact.
Okay, great. So I think one of the things that we tried to do in developing the framework was to come up with an approach that could be used to analyze the political party space more broadly, or that could be adapted to focus in on a very specific issue. So although the example that I gave in my presentation focused on women's political participation, I think that the approach would be similar in the sense of if what you're focusing on is the extent to which political parties or the political system addresses, let's just say, quality of life issues, whether it's healthcare or other things, then you would ask the same questions, but focused on, so what's the political will issue as it affects how policies are developed and implemented in this country? What's the capacity issue? And then what's the space issue? So that's how I would take that. I'm going to leave you to take your grain since you're going there next week.
Anything on Islam?
I mean, here I could speak a little bit for NDI because I've had a fair amount of contact with the programming. NDI has regularly worked with Islamist parties in the Middle East and other parts of the Muslim world. It's done so as part of its commitment to work across the spectrum with a range of parties that are either part of the parliament or part of the broader political scene. And I'd say it's had good experiences in those cases of parties that are interested in learning both about campaign techniques, but more importantly, basic grassroots organizing, political parties. I mean, I can tell you the story one side. It's not NDI, it's with IRI. I was in Indonesia doing some research on parties. And I went to see a party which was a very conservative Islamist party, fundamentalist Islamist party with the type that was out demonstrating in front of the US Embassy on many days. And this was close to 9/11, soon after, so things were emotional. And I went to see them, and we were talking, and I'd just been in Egypt before that recently, and I was curious about their ties with the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. And so I was talking with them about that, and I said, well, who are your best friends? And they thought about it, and they said, we really like IRI, the Republican Institute. And I said, really? That's surprising. This was, the time of George Bush and the presidency and so forth. I said, why is that? And they said, well, they've come to this country, and they offered these seminars, and we started going along to them. And this was during the days when Republicans had the White House, and they seem to know how to win elections. And we want to do that too. And they take us seriously. And it communicated a very positive message in the Islamist sector in Indonesia that was the case. The party of George Bush was there working person to person, colleague to colleague, equal to equal, to work with them. So I think that's a powerful example of the value of working with parties across the spectrum, not just Islam, but other ideologies in other contexts.
Thanks, Tom. I mean, I would simply add that as we work right across the political spectrum, we have many good relationships with parties from all sectors. And often, in some cases, as we talked about earlier, parties are more responsive after a poor election because they recognize that they need to change the way they organize and operate. And that's not just in the developing world where we're working, but indeed in countries like my own, parties are much more responsive in looking at how they can change after a bad election than they are if they feel things are going well for them. So we have had that. On the case of consultants, it's not been a huge issue for us. There are countries I know where there's a lot of money sloshing around in the political process, and there are a lot of consultants here on off years who have nothing better to do and think they can go and make a lot of money in some of these countries. I think it's also our work. We obviously have to do some campaign work with parties because if there's an election, and it depends on where we entered in the cycle, if there's an election on the horizon, then parties want to be able to campaign and do the best they can in the campaign. But for us, our greater interest is the long-term capacity building organizational structures that are there long after the election. The interesting thing I say, we don't have parties here in the US, and now I can use the term you, we understand them elsewhere in the world. The parties here are much more campaign vehicles, they're candidate driven, they're in permanent election cycle. In many countries, the election is a 3-week or 4-week event that happens every 4 to 5 years. So what the parties do in a non-election period, in terms of building that organization, engaging with citizens, and putting in place a structure, not a campaign structure, but a structure that is actually talking to citizens, is far more important. And unfortunately, in some of this hiring of often US campaign consultants, they see it in terms of a campaign. And that perpetuates the problem that when the election is over and the checks are written and they're all gone home, we still don't have a party system, and we don't have parties who can continue then to put down roots and organize themselves. So it's not been an issue for us. And I would say just briefly while we're talking on, I'm totally opposed to direct financial assistance to parties, and I come at it from 2 fronts. Firstly, when I sat on the other side of the desk, if the German Stiftungen came to me and said, we can write you a check or we can involve you in some really good capacity building programs, I would say, give me the check, because the parties are always looking for money. That's the first thing. I'm totally in favor of public funding of parties. I think you have to publicly fund parties in a fair and equitable way, and it gets at often the issue of governing parties dominating and using the powers of office. But that's a different thing. In terms of parties, what we have to do is build their capacity, get them to understand better what they need to do, because it's not all about money, despite what you see here. Politics is not all about money, and you can often see some of the best campaigns are run on a shoestring because the message is right and they're engaging citizens with the proper outreach and engagement. So on that note, I would like to, first of all, thank our panelists and give them a round of applause. I would like to thank all of you for coming. And I want to recognize, we mentioned Nick Benson, but the other two members of my team, Philippa Wood and Hannah Murr, who has also been working on this and putting this event together. So we're a small team, but we turn out a lot on any given day, and I want to acknowledge them and appreciate the work that they do. And just finally to say, this isn't the end, this is the beginning of the discussion. We hope that these publications and these opportunities will continue to provide an opportunity for us to talk about the issues that continue to change in terms of not just party assistance, but party assistance position within the overall democracy. Thank you very much indeed.
Everything.